kind of global macro earthquakes. Clearly, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine led to sanctions against Russia. You're saying, well, okay, Boeing makes aircraft. They need titanium and aluminum. Where does that come from? Turns out about 30% of it comes from Russia. So 3 or 4 cases in a neighborhood, they'll lock down the whole building or whole neighborhood. 20 or 50 cases, they'll lock down the whole city. And they have. Supply chain is not part of the economy. Supply chain is the economy. In other words, if you want to understand the economy, you're really talking about the supply chain at every aspect. Something as simple as a loaf of bread. You buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store. Like, okay, well, I guess it came from a baker, and I guess they took it from the bakery to the store by truck. So there's a supply chain. Well, that's about as simple a version of the supply chain as you can imagine. You have to just start going from there. It's like, well, did the bread come in a plastic wrapper or a paper wrapper? Well, that wrapper came from somebody. Where'd the truck come from? Well, obviously a truck manufacturer. Where'd the driver come from? Somebody had to make a career choice and be trained. And what about the diesel fuel in the truck? That came from a refinery, and that came from oil exploration. Then you get back to the baker, and it's like, oh, well, I guess he had an oven or she had an oven. Where did that come from? And then you find out that the ovens are, industrial ovens have parts from 25 different countries and so forth. Well, without belaboring that point, you get back to the farmer and the wheat and the fertilizer and everything else, and really what's called the extended supply chain. And you're like, wait a second, that's a huge number of countries, a huge number of imports, and a big part of the economy, which it is. And then every link in that supply chain I described has its own supply chain behind it to get to source materials and intermediate manufacturing and so forth. And then that's for a loaf of bread. Well, what about, your alarm clock, your car, your furniture, your clothes, and on and on and on. Again, you see the point that once you start thinking about what supply chains are, you realize it's just the cardiopulmonary system of the entire global economy. So to get back specifically to your question, Julia, the supply chain book shines a light on the entire global economic process. So Europe's in a recession, going to get a lot worse. China's in a recession, going to get a lot worse. Japan just kind of falls victim to everything else we're describing. When consumption's down, there's demand destruction because of higher interest rates. Japan's an export powerhouse. Well, guess what? Their exports start to shrink drastically because no one's buying their stuff. Same for South Korea. So what we're looking at, Julia, is a global recession, and those are rare. It's one thing to say, well, Germany's in a recession, or the U.S. is in a recession, or Japan. Japan's had 9 recessions in the last 30 years. They're in a 30-year depression is a better way to describe it. But usually there's some economy somewhere that's doing okay, and kind of, they used to use the phrase locomotive. It's the locomotive that pulls the rest of the train, out of the ditch or up the hill, as the case may be. But a global recession, which we did have in 2008, with the exception of Australia. Australia seems to be recession-proof, but they did have a recession in 2020. But we're looking at a global recession, and that would be if we're lucky. If we're not lucky, we'll have a global financial panic on top of that. So this is the bigger picture, the macro picture, but it comes at the same time that we see a supply chain breakdown, and that's what the book's about. So now all of a sudden you had the science I described, computing and artificial intelligence and applied math, and a true global market. So now the supply chains could go 9,000 miles from Chongqing to New York, or from Shanghai to Seattle, or London to Hong Kong, of course. So this was true globalization, much larger scale, much longer supply chains, and it worked. And so this was a period I call supply chain 1.0. 30-year period from 1989 to 2019. Now, why did it break down around 2019? I mean, and I talked to people. I talked to one individual in particular. I was CEO of a Fortune 10 company. He was probably the single individual most responsible for building the modern supply chain. There were a lot of people involved, of course, but this guy was really the leader and is recognized as such. And he told me, because I interviewed him for the book, he said, Jim, you have to understand, it took us 30 years to build this. We blew it up in about 3 years. It's not going to come back overnight. It's going to take 5 or 10 years or maybe longer to rebuild in some form. And I think that's exactly right. So to your point, Julia, what was it, around 2019 that did cause it to break down? Well, really, three things. A lot of people look at the pandemic and they go, oh yeah, COVID, that disrupted everything. That was the problem. And some people look at the war in Ukraine and the Russian sanctions and go, that was the problem. And they both made it worse. They both made it worse, no doubt about it, made the supply chain worse. But it really started in 2018 with Trump's tariffs on China. Now, I don't want to debate the tariffs. That's a policy issue. I happen to think they were a good idea and overdue. A lot of people disagree with that, but it doesn't matter. He did it. And so Trump put tariffs on appliances and solar panels. Now, technically they were global, but most of that stuff was coming from China. So this was really a shot aimed directly at China. Well, China didn't stand still for that. So China said, well, what can we do to strike back? Well, at the time, China was and is the world's largest importer of soybeans. They need the protein. They don't have enough. The U.S. and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. Well, China was buying all their soybeans from the United States because they were trying to reduce the trade deficit. We were buying so much stuff from them, and China said, well, what can we buy from the U.S. just to kind of balance the books a little bit? And the answer was soybeans. Well, when Trump put the tariffs on, China redirected all of their soybean orders to Brazil. They stopped buying U.S. soybeans and they bought them all from Brazil. Well, there's a lot more to that than a phone call. I mean, you got vessels and dry bulk carriers and transportation lanes and port facilities. And, if you're Brazil and you get all these orders, you got to get trucks to get the soybeans to the ports. You got to open up port facilities. If you're a cargo vessel operator, you got to redirect all your routes. You got to break long-term contracts, et cetera. The point is, this is a major shift in global logistics just to change the order book from the U.S. to Brazil. Beyond that, people involved in this, they don't want 6-month contracts. They want 5-year contracts or at least 3-year contracts, and they got them. And so now all of a sudden, China's buying all their soybeans from Brazil, but this scrambled global supply chains. Now, what are the U.S. farmers doing? Well, they were like, hey, we're still growing the soybeans. We can't sell them to China. Well, it turns out the Netherlands needed them. So, okay, we'll sell them to the Netherlands and distribute them to Europe, which they did. But once again, instead of Port of Los Angeles, you're using Port of Houston or Port of Port Elizabeth near New York or whatever. And then this went on and on because Trump put more tariffs on to retaliate. China took more actions against the United States, canceled purchase. And it escalated from there. And by the way, there's very good data on this. It's not just a theory. I found some research, which I mentioned in my book, and give the source for that. But it's a book by Lorianne LaRocco, who's a maritime cargo expert. And what's interesting about what she did, this data is available. We know where the vessels go. We know what's in them. We know when they leave and when they arrive. They all have GPS connections and people keep track. So you can look at all this data. So she tracked what I just described, which was this rearrangement of orders and supply chains, what they call transportation lanes and all that. But here's what's interesting. She finished her book around December 2019. So it's like a controlled experiment in terms of pandemic, because if you'd written the book later, you'd see the disruption, but you'd have a very difficult time. Well, how much of that was tariffs and how much of that was COVID? It's when you have two things going on at once, it's very hard to separate the impact.